Welcome, welcome. I feel like the energy is a little low in here, so we're going to try to bring it up. I am so happy to be here for a great conversation about really the role that traceability and tracking can play in potentially enabling a more circular economy. So to have that conversation, I'm here with Deon, the Vice President and General Manager of Avery Dennison, and Kate Daly, the Managing Director of the Center for the Circular Economy at Closed Loop Partners. So to start us off, Deon, I think a lot of people in the room might think and agree that we've been talking about traceability and tracking for decades. Where are we now?
Well, if you recall, if you go back a number of years, the only way in which we could trace products was typically through barcodes on labels, and even before that, just on handwritten labels. I think the change that we've seen over the last 10 years has been that barcodes in themselves have a line of sight problem. You can only read them when you can see them. And the technology, particularly around technologies such as RFID, have evolved to allow us to be able to read data remotely via a reader. That's opened up a world of possibility because now we're able to not only ensure that we can capture data at each point of the supply chain, but use that data to understand where the business dynamics may be and ultimately how we apply it across the supply chain as well. I think that technology, whether it be UHF or NFC, these are terms you'll hear in the future as well, have allowed us to be able to shine a light on where the disconnects are in the supply chain, as well as what do we do with consumer enablement in the future.
So what does that future look like? If you think 10, 20 years in the future, what is this system? If it gets to scale, if everything is traceable and trackable, what are we talking about?
So we have a view in our business that we believe every physical item in the future will have a digital identity. And because it has a digital identity, we're able to connect brands and retailers with individuals through that physical product. And that physical product in itself, because it has digital identity, will be able to provide information throughout its journey, from the start all the way through to its use at the consumer level, and ultimately to its disposal or reuse in the future. That information is going to be able to provide a real new opportunity for us to do things we've never been able to do in the past. It's going to be able to allow us to create communities of individuals as they utilize products. It's going to be able to allow us to reduce the amount of waste that we have through the supply chain, and it's going to be allow us and consumers to be able to look at their products, find a way to reuse or recycle them, and ultimately in the future, make better use of the net environmental impact that we have across the supply chain.
Very promising in theory, and we can get into some of the details on how to actually do that. But Kate, before we do, map that vision onto circularity and sort of the future aspiration of what a circular economy could be.
I think that the transition from our current linear take, make, waste system to one that is circular is so complex and interconnected that technologies that enable digital identity and material passports are really going to be critical for us to be able to track these materials so that waste, it remains as a resource, that it remains in play. And I think that, we feel a huge sense of urgency around this. If we use apparel as one case study, the issues of overproduction and the inefficiencies in those business models are really contributing to a huge amount of negative impact. So if you think about it, currently, the apparel industry produces 100 billion articles of apparel each year for our planet of 7.5 billion people. 30% of that material, that apparel, is never sold, and 85% of it ends up in a landfill. And so there's huge economic implications for that. One example, in New York City, where I live, the sanitation department spends $60 million each year carting textiles to landfills. So there are the cost efficiencies to municipalities from this waste, and certainly to the brands themselves who can introduce more efficiencies. And we see the current waste and inefficiency as actually an opportunity for innovation, and technology needs to play a role there.
Thanks. So let's get more specific. In apparel, Avery Dennison has a partnership with Ralph Lauren. Talk a little bit about what that project looks like in practice on the ground.
So with that company, we've been able to take a typical tag and label they use on their items of clothing and make it a digital label in the sense that it has a digital identity. At the source, we attach the label at the garment manufacturer for Ralph Lauren, and that goes through their supply chain. That allows them to do three things. One is understand where the product has come through the supply chain, add information to that label stored in its digital identity about how the product was made and where it was made, the provenance of that product, and then through their supply chain, utilize that to drive higher levels of inventory accuracy. So by able to say, where do I need my items when they get to store to their wholesale channel? The end piece of it, which is the piece they're still now working on, is how do I then use that label with that item of clothing to engage directly the consumer on a one-to-one basis? Because every item of clothing is uniquely identified, not at an SKU level, so this blazer is the same across 100 items, but this one uniquely identified, associated with that consumer, should they opt into that, then allows a conversation to talk to them about the benefits of that product, when it needs to be reused or resold or repurposed, or indeed the next time the consumer then goes into store to look for the next item of Ralph Lauren clothing. That's one example, and there's numerous examples throughout the supply chain we see where people use a similar technology.
What's wrong with a stupid label? Like, why can't my label on my clothing do that now?
I think it has two things. So one is it's a static data field, effectively. On the label that you have, I assume, let's say, the care and content label you have, it just gives you static information. It also requires you to go and physically look at it. When we turn that into a digital version of that label and we store the data in the cloud, as it moves through the supply chain, you can add or augment to that data. So where did it go through a port of authority? What was the temperature around that? How was it handled when it was started? When it gets to store, retailers and brands now are able to use that for what they call high levels of inventory accuracy. Bear in mind, the apparel industry over time has been very much a push model. I'm not sure what I'm going to sell, so I'm just going to buy and I'm going to push it out into stores. That creates enormous inefficiency and waste. Because we now have access to the data to understand what is getting sold at the point of retail and understand how to source it more efficiently, the whole apparel industry is gearing itself to becoming much more of a demand-driven industry. And that allows us to have significantly reduced inventory throughout the supply chain, not having to be sold at the end of life or just disposed into landfill as Kate has identified.
And Lauren, I'll just add that counterfeiting is a huge challenge for the apparel industry. And so any opportunity where a technology like this can both help solve for a loss issue like that for the industry and also allows the waste facilities downstream to be able to identify the material composition of an article of clothing. Currently with the cloth or paper tags in all of our clothes, many people cut those tags out after purchase. Sometimes the tags can be inaccurate. Knowing whether an article of clothing is 100% cotton or a poly blend is critical to know how it can be reused, how it can be reincorporated into the textile stream.
Is there an economic consideration of, for luxury goods, that counterfeiting is a really big challenge. It's not really a huge challenge if it's in fast fashion. Are there applications maybe within apparel for non-luxury items or beyond apparel that you think are really taking off?
There are, and maybe Kate can sort of follow up on this. The first application we're seeing, which is pretty much predominantly there now, is this kind of concept of inventory accuracy, which many of the world's retailers and brands are now using. How do I make sure that what I order and gets to store meets the demand of the consumer in store? And that's really helped transform and shine a light on that supply chain piece. I think outside of luxury, which you highlighted, typically for the midpoint and low point price brands and retailers, there is the ability then to be able to use those items to engage directly with consumers about what else can I do as a consumer and brand relationship to augment that discussion. And at the end of that is, more specifically, we're starting to work with a couple of customers now. We're saying, how do I provide and use that digital label to tell consumers what to do with an item when it's at its end of its life? For luxury items, that may well be reuse and resell and repurpose. For some of the midpoint and low point price items, it's more around you can use the label to give you directions as to where to take this for recycling purposes, be it chemical or mechanical in the future as well.
Mm-hmm. Kate, how about for you?
Yeah, I would just add that it really is the case that technology needs to serve multiple purposes, and that you have to track the innovation not just to the efficiency and to solving the current problems, but also solving the problems of the future. So one example where we've seen technologies like these as an enabler of solving multiple problems is a company called Algramo. And Algramo is a delivery system of home goods like detergent or shampoo, and it started out in South America in mobile units and is now coming to the US. And you'd be able to take a container and be able to refill whatever quantity you need of those household goods. So it's solving for you not needing to use a single serve or multiple use plastic bottle. You can use a reusable container but at the same time it solves for the fact that many people cannot afford to buy in bulk. And so that's led to the sale of sachets, of single-serve home care products or personal hygiene products. And those sachets are a tremendous part of the litter problem and getting plastic into our waterways in Southeast Asia. And so here, by being able to trace and offer customer incentives and the digital identification that comes with bringing back a reusable, you're also enabling a variety of income levels to participate in buying that product and reducing impacts across the board. So being able to have those variables and diversity in what you're accomplishing is really important.
There's so much good that can come out of this. I think one concern that I hear a lot is on data security and privacy. I mean, who owns this information? Where does it live? How do you ensure that consumers' information isn't shared publicly? What do you think, Deon?
Well, I think the way that most responsible brands and retailers are handling this is the data associated with their physical items and that are uniquely identified are held by the retailer and brand. And ultimately, then the consumer has to choose, as you currently do with any loyalty scheme that are out there, that you have to choose to opt in. And I think this is going to be one of the discussions for the future is consumers will get a benefit from opting into a one-to-one relationship with a brand or retailer. But for that opt-in, they're also giving up some of their own data in terms of their preferences and so forth. And I think the way that the data is maintained is a key part of the discussion in the future, but I don't see an issue when it comes to consumer privacy because it will always require the consumer to ultimately want to opt into this at the point where they are approached by the brand or retailer. The other thing I'd say as well, just from a slightly different perspective, the technology that we're talking about will also enable many other vertical supply chains. So for example, in food, we see a significant uptick in food retailing and food brand ownership and the food supply chain just to get rid of waste, for example, or to address the issue of food-borne viruses and illnesses which kill thousands of people every year just here in the United States.
Great. I want to ask Sidebar a question in just a minute, but before I do that, working with one brand is one thing, but obviously we're talking about value chains here. So who needs to be at the table and collaborating around some of this work to make sure it actually succeeds and sort of the theory that could be possible around traceable and connected goods can come to fruition? Kate?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think what we all in this room see across all of our sectors is that there's still such a disconnect between the design phase and the infrastructure that exists to handle those products and the packaging that they come in. And so for us, the low-hanging fruit is to make sure that at the brands, the design departments have an understanding of what happens to those products and packaging at end of life and have the people who manage infrastructure in the room to be a part of that conversation.
I also think that these technology developments that we have are just at the infancy of what the possibility that they can create. But more than that, I think it's going to take a broader ecosystem to make this happen. It's not just individual companies like our own, but our own company with all the competitors and every player in the value chain is ultimately have to work together to create, for example, the infrastructure at the end, whether it be chemical recycling or more mechanical recycling that allows some of the end circularity objectives to be achieved. And I think how we go about that is going to largely depend on industry collaboration and people like, for example, Kate's company that focus in on how do we support through investment purposes that type of development.
Mm-hmm. Are you finding?
Well, it's true. We're in such a phase of experimentation right now that when brands act in isolation, they're more subject to criticism. And so by acting collaboratively, you really de-risk the amount of experimentation that we can all do together.
And you're finding that the right people are coming to the table?
I think there's a greater willingness for people to do that because I think the recognition that the challenges we're all trying to solve are not, they're singularly daunting, but in order to make progress, we have to take the first steps. And Kate's point is very true. When you're able to collaborate on a broader basis, you de-risk, you re-look at the technology, and you actually drive a lot more innovation as well at the same time collectively than individually.
That's great. Sidebar, Heather and Sarah, what do you have for us?
So I'm going to try to glom to get several questions together, but they really have to do with the investment on the part of the companies in collecting this information. So how do you protect intellectual property that may be proprietary to a company? And in addition, how do you change the process of analyzing that information? So all of this great information is going to be collected. Now, how do you have to change the back-end systems to allow it to be able to make good use of that information?
Well, I'll have a stab at that. I think let me take the second part first, which is about how does the industry allow itself to be able to read all this data? I think there's a number of other technology developments that are happening. A lot of people talk about AI, but in and itself, the ability to automate data and the analysis of data, I think, is going to significantly help retailers and brands make more sense of their data. I also think that the technology that we would use, be it RFID or UHF or Bluetooth, whatever the case may be, allows for more data to be collected. So the challenge for industry is going to be what to do with that. I think the capability from an overall technology perspective and AI will allow us to do better assessment and much more predictive analytics about what is to come. That's in play right now at the moment, and most of the retailers I talk to are talking about how do they transform from static data into predictive analysis, and they're investing in these areas right now as we speak. On the first question, going back to the data privacy piece as well, I think most retailers and brands will hold the data that they have and make sure, as they currently do for their own IP, that it's relatively secure. I also think there's going to be a point in some of this, and we're involved in some of these broader consortiums, where companies will also have to recognize that some of their IP can enable the industry at a broader level rather than just the company level. And having to make a decision about collaborating on that and opening the access for that, I think we're also at the start of that industry-wide discussion as well.
Great. Is there one more question from the sidebar?
Yeah, are there concerns over electronic waste? So if you're adding all of these little technology gadgets to these items, then it creates sort of a potential trade-off in that area.
That's a great question, something that we've been thinking about quite a bit. And I think that as we look at what the future holds for the processing of textile waste, we certainly see that textile chemical recycling is going to have to play a huge role because of the volume of blends in the marketplace. About 60% of clothing on the rack is a blend, which makes mechanical recycling very challenging, of cotton to cotton, of mechanical recycling that's available today. And so with any textile recycling, there's the complexity of you need to remove the zippers, the buttons, et cetera. And we think that these e-waste tracking devices are just going to be part of that overall sortation processing challenge that is already in place for these very diverse materials and compositions.
And at the secondary layer below that, industries like ourselves, in terms of production of these intelligent labels at the end of the day, we're exploring very different chemical compositions that allow us to be able to either make these more compostable or actually find a way to actually recycle the tags themselves, because they are, at the end of the day, they're semiconductor chips, and how we be able to reuse them just points to another part of the circularity of the industry that's going to be required in the future.
Great. Thank you. So there are a lot of companies in the room that make things, and I'm sure many of them are wondering, should I be thinking about adopting this for my supply chain? So what words of advice would you give folks if they're newer to their journey of traceability and tracking of goods, as many are? What have you learned, and what advice can you give them?
Jump in immediately. I was just kidding. So, I think as everyone here knows, there are always unintended consequences when we sort of put innovation first. And so that's where, our premise is, as we work very closely with a lot of different brands, is that it's really collaboration that comes first, and that helps guide that innovation. So I think these are technologies that everyone should be aware of and start assessing what is the application, and I know many of you are already doing that. But I think, we would encourage a sort of collective approach of de-risking these technologies together so that there's more alignment and less diversification as they flow downstream.
I just echo what Kate said. I start now. While the scale of it, as I said earlier on, seems daunting, just get going. They're very practical steps to utilizing the technology in specific proof of concepts if you choose to. We know the technologies work across the spectrum. There are a number of companies, not least ourselves, that are able to provide that support. Start now and build experience, and then learn from that, and then collaborate across the industry to maximize further technology development.
Encouraging words. Well, please join me in thanking Kate and Deon for their time.
Thank